When billionaire Charles Langford discovers he has a secret son, a doctor who grew up without wealth or privilege, his world unravels. Lies, betrayal, and a hidden legacy threaten to destroy his empire. But the greatest revelation, the power of truth, love, and second chances. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Charles Langford stood at the window of his penthouse office, looking down at New York City. Everything below him belonged to his empire, the Langford Group. At 60 years old, he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his custom suit cost more than what most people made in a month. But today something felt different, empty. "Mr. Langford, your 2 o'clock appointment is here," his assistant Sandra called through the intercom. "Cancel it," Charles said, not moving from the window. "Cancel everything for today." He needed a drink. The bar in his office was stocked with the finest liquors money could buy, but lately they all tasted the same. Bitter, like regret. Charles loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of whiskey. His phone buzzed again, probably Sandra trying. To remind him about the board meeting tomorrow. He ignored it. Instead, he walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was an old photograph, worn at the edges. He usually kept it locked away, just like the memories it brought back. In the picture, a young Charles smiled at the camera, his arm around a beautiful woman with kind eyes. Margaret. They were standing in front of their first apartment, a tiny place in Queens that leaked when it rained. But they had been happy there, so happy. "Mr. Langford," Sandra's voice came through again, more urgent this time. "Your son Richard is on line 1. He says it's about the merger." Charles put the picture away. Richard, his son from his second marriage, the one who grew up with everything money could buy, the one who turned out just like him, cold, ambitious, alone. "Tell him I'll call back," Charles said. He needed to get out of the office, away from the phones, the meetings, the endless parade of people who wanted something from him. He grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator. "But sir, the board is expecting," Sandra started to say. "I'm taking the rest of the day off," Charles cut her off. It was probably the first time he'd said those words in 20 years. Down in the lobby, his driver was waiting with the usual black Mercedes. But Charles walked past him. "Take the afternoon off, James," he said. "I'll catch a cab." The doorman looked surprised but hailed a taxi. As Charles slid into the back seat, he noticed how different it felt from his luxury car. Real. Like the life he used to live before all this. "Where to?" the driver asked. He was an older man, probably around Charles's age, with grey hair and tired eyes. "Just drive," Charles said, taking out his phone to check the stock market. Old habits die hard. The taxi merged into traffic, and Charles tried to focus on the numbers on his screen. That's when he saw it. The flash of gold as the driver's hand moved on the steering wheel. A ring, not just any ring. His heart stopped. 25 years ago, he had saved for months to buy that ring. It was nothing fancy, a simple gold band with a small pattern etched into it. But he had it specially made with their initials hidden in the design. He had given it to Margaret the night before he left for his big chance in Manhattan. The night he promised he'd come back for her. The night he lied. Charles leaned forward, his hands shaking. "That ring," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Where did you get it?" The driver glanced at his hand, then met Charles's eyes in the rearview mirror. "It belonged to my late wife," he said softly. "She always told me it was given to her by someone she once loved." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Charles felt sick. "Your wife," he managed to say. "What was her name?" The driver sighed, and in that moment Charles knew. He knew before the man even opened his mouth. "Margaret," the driver said. "Her name was Margaret." Charles closed his eyes. The memories flooded back, her smile, her laugh, the way she used to sing while making coffee in their tiny kitchen, the way she cried when he left, the letter she sent a month later, the one he never answered. Did she? Charles's throat was dry. Did she have any children? The driver's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Yes, a son, but he never knew his real father. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. A son. He had another son. Where is he now? Charles whispered, though part of him didn't want to know, didn't want to face what he'd done. He's a doctor at St. Mary's Hospital, the driver said. Works the night shift in the ER, taking care of people who were left behind. The irony was like a knife to the gut. Charles thought about all the hospitals that bore the Langford name, all the medical research his company funded, and his own son, the one he'd abandoned, was working night shifts in a regular city hospital. "Stop the car," Charles said suddenly. The taxi pulled over. Charles's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get his wallet out. "Your name," he said to the driver. "What's your name?" "Frank," the driver said. "Frank Miller." "Frank," Charles repeated. "You raised him?" Frank nodded. "Like my own, because he was my own. Blood doesn't make a father, Mr. Langford. Being there does." Charles felt the weight of those words. Of course, Frank knew who he was. His face was in the business pages often enough. "Does he know?" Charles asked. "Does he know who I am?" Frank shook his head. "Margaret never told him. Said there was no point in letting him grow up bitter. We gave him my last name, raised him with love. That's all he needed to know." Charles pulled out all the cash in his wallet and several $100s. "The fare," he said, handing it to Frank, but Frank only took $20. "Keep it," he said. "Your money can't fix the past, Mr. Langford." As Charles stepped out of the taxi, Frank rolled down his window. "His name is Michael," he said. "Michael Miller. He's working tonight, if you're wondering." The taxi pulled away, leaving Charles standing on the sidewalk, his world completely upturned. He had another son, a doctor, someone who helped people instead of using them. His phone buzzed again. The board meeting, the merger, Richard, his empire. None of it seemed to matter anymore, because somewhere in this city, in a busy emergency room, was the son he'd never known, the one who grew up without his money, without his name, without his influence. And somehow, he'd turned out better than Charles ever had. Charles walked into his empty penthouse apartment, his mind still spinning from the taxi ride. He hadn't even noticed where he'd ended up. His feet had carried him home on autopilot. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky orange, but he barely saw it. His phone had 27 missed calls. Most were from Sandra, his assistant. 5 were from Richard. 1 was from his ex-wife, Victoria. He ignored them all and poured himself another drink. Michael Miller, his son, a doctor. Charles walked to his computer and typed the name into the search bar. St. Mary's Hospital's website came up. There he was. Michael Miller, MD, Emergency Medicine. The photo showed a young man with dark hair and a kind smile. Margaret's smile. The phone rang again. This time, Charles picked up. "Where the hell have you been?" Richard's voice was sharp, angry. "The board is furious. The merger." "Not now, Richard," Charles cut him off. "Not now. Dad, this is a billion-dollar deal. Our stock price—" "I said not. Now." Charles rarely raised his voice. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with surprise. "Dad?" Richard's voice was different now, uncertain. "Are you okay?" Charles looked at Michael's photo on the screen. "I don't know," he said, honestly. "I need some time to think." "Think? Since when do you need time to think? You're Charles Langford. You act. That's what you've always taught me." Yes, that's what he'd taught Richard. Act first, think later, make the deal, close the sale, never show weakness, never look back. Look. Where that had gotten them both. "I'll call you tomorrow," Charles said and hung up. He spent the next hour reading everything he could find about Michael online. Graduated top of his class from medical school. Published research on emergency care in underserved communities. Volunteered at free clinics. The phone rang again. Victoria. Charles. Her voice was cool, controlled, like always. "Richard called. Me, he's worried about you." "I'm fine." "No, you're not. You've never missed a board meeting in your life. What's going on?" Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you remember what I was like when we met, Victoria? Hungry, ambitious, nothing else mattered but success." "Of course I remember. That's why I married you. We were the same." "Yes, we were. Both too busy building our careers. To raise our son. And look how he turned out, just like us." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Why are you saying all this? What's happened?" Charles looked at Michael's photo again. I found out something today, something that changes everything. Charles, you're scaring me. I have another son. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. What are you talking about? Victoria finally asked. Before you. Before? All this? There was someone else? Margaret? I left her to come to Manhattan to make my fortune. She was pregnant. I never knew. Oh my God, Victoria whispered. Does Richard know? No one knows, except his stepfather, and now you. What are you going to do? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? What was he going to do? Charles stood up and walked to his window. St. Mary's Hospital was somewhere out there in the city. His son was there right now, working the night shift, saving lives. I'm going to meet him, Charles said. Are you crazy? Think about what this could do to the company, to Richard, to our reputation. There it was. Reputation, image, the things that had ruled his life for so long. I don't care anymore, Charles said, and realized it was true. Charles, listen to me. Whatever guilt you're feeling, we can handle this quietly. Set up a trust fund. Make sure he's taken care of. But don't... Goodbye, Victoria, Charles said and hung up. He changed out of his expensive suit into something simpler, a plain shirt and slacks. No tie, no gold cufflinks, no CEO armor. His driver was surprised to see him again so soon. St. Mary's. To hospital, Charles said as he got into the car. Are you feeling unwell, sir? The driver asked. Charles looked out the window at the city lights. I've been unwell for 25 years, he said quietly. I just didn't know it. The drive to the hospital felt both too long and too short. Charles's heart was pounding as they pulled up to the emergency entrance. Inside, the waiting room was busy with the usual night crowd. A tired-looking nurse sat at the front desk. Her name tag read, Jenny. I'm looking for Dr. Miller, Charles said. Are you a patient? No, What was he, a father, a stranger, a ghost from the past? I need to speak with him. It's important. Jenny looked skeptical. Dr. Miller is with patients right now. Unless it's an emergency,